We'll say a quick word about the topic, because I think there's no more relevant topic today than expanding U.S. engagement in Asia, because clearly, if you wanted to ask yourself, what are the key factors that will determine the course of events in this region, the nature and depth of the U.S. engagement will be one of the key driving forces of how this region evolves. And as I was discussing privately with the four panelists, there has been a history of ups and downs in the U.S.-Asia relationship, and it's more specifically, if I use ASEAN as an example, I'm trying to write a book on ASEAN. I've just finished writing a few thousand words on the U.S.-ASEAN relationship. It began with a massive love affair in the Cold War. In fact, ASEAN was actually born very much as an American project in the 1967. And in fact, U.S.-ASEAN relations became very, very close during the Cold War. I think after the Cold War, as I maintained, there was a certain degree of strategic neglect on the part of the United States of the region. But after 9/11 happened, there was a kind of rediscovery of the strategic importance of Southeast Asia. And so the engagement between U.S. and Asia again became stronger in that regard. But that's my view of history. I'm sure these panelists may have a different view, and will challenge it, and so, which is good, because we will have a good discussion. So the question, therefore, is where do we go from now in terms of United States engagement in Asia? That's what we'll try to discuss in a robust 1-hour discussion. So to get the ball rolling, we thought we'd start with Joe. And Joe, do you want to give us your perspective, maybe initially using the U.S.-Malaysia relationship as a basis, to describe how you see the state of play in terms of the U.S. role in the region?
Well, thank you very much, Kishore. Lovely to be here. And you're very famous also in KL, by the way. As you mentioned, when we talk about U.S. rebalance to Asia, I think Malaysia is really a case in point of what has happened over the last 5-6 years and what we can expect in the future. You know, especially the diplomatic side of U.S.-Malaysia relationship was not always this good. We had tough times. I'm sure many of you will recall in '99 when Vice President Al Gore went there. And really, I would say the thing that has made enormous difference is, number one, Prime Minister Najib and him wanting to look towards US as well as Western Europe. And number two, the commitment shown by President Obama to rebalance our policy much more towards Asia. And in fact, President Obama came to Malaysia April last year. This was the first visit by US President since Lyndon Johnson. I think most of your students were not even born, you know, when Lyndon Johnson was president. So that was a big deal. And at that time, the two, Prime Minister Najib and President Obama, inked what we call a comprehensive partnership agreement. That comprehensive partnership agreement is pretty much a roadmap for what we want to accomplish over the next decade or two. And you can see many steps have already been taken place. Let me just give you a few examples. Over the last 2 months, we've had every service in the US, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, to do a joint bilateral exercise with the Malaysian counterparts. We're making very big progress on TPP, in which, of course, Singapore is also part of. And I really do expect big movement in TPP. Last, I do want to mention people-to-people ties. In fact, when I went there, when President got there, he announced that we will begin to examine so that Malaysia can be part of what we call a visa waiver program, so that the process is not complete. This will make Malaysia probably the only country which is Muslim majority that is included in a visa waiver program. And so these relationships are building, and I hope, and in fact I count myself very, very lucky to be at Malaysia at this time, and I think we'll see a lot more. So maybe we'll end there and then turn to others. Yeah.
I'm surprised you didn't mention the famous golf game in Hawaii. Another high point in U.S.-Malaysia relations.
I think that was, in fact, it is, what I would, the two have formed very close relationship, which is why, with very little time left, they found out they would be in Hawaii together at the same time for vacation. So why not, Yeah.
Good. Golf is very important. So, Derek, we turn to you now. From your perspective, sitting in Myanmar, how does it look, the U.S.-Asia relationship?
Well, first of all, Kishore, thank you. I want to add my thanks to you and to the school here for welcoming us. I listened to my friend Joe talk about tough times in a bilateral relationship. I think when you talk about the U.S. and Myanmar, I don't think anyone can take a back seat to the U.S. and Myanmar when it comes to tough times in our history. We did not really know each other. We were completely alienated from each other just until 2011, 2012. And Joe was part of that when he was the principal deputy at the State Department. And I became envoy. And it has been, I think, a step-by-step process to get to know each other again, to re-engage each other. It talks about expanding engagement in Asia. If there's any place where we have expanded engagement in Asia, if we're going to truly do that, we had to look at Myanmar and figure out if there was a way we can re-engage and try to put our relationship on a track that helped to shape changes on the ground as they occurred. And as we thought about it, I mean, if you look at Asia broadly and you look at simply the geography of Myanmar, and you look at Asia, which is a sort of artificial construct, of course, but essentially Myanmar is the crossroad of Asia. It links South Asia with Southeast Asia. It is a missing piece, in essence, if we are going to engage Asia. And we're going to link ourselves to the dynamism of South Asia and the dynamism of Southeast Asia and East Asia. It makes sense for us to reach out and work with Myanmar in the process. It was also the missing piece in ASEAN. If we were going to re-engage ASEAN, then we had to ensure that we were giving a chance for the bilateral relationship with Myanmar. And it was one of the issues of most contention in the U.S.-Southeast Asia relationship, the U.S.-ASEAN relationship, that we could not get along with Myanmar, we couldn't work with Myanmar. So in terms of our overall expanding of our strategic engagement of Asia, you can look at Myanmar as a centerpiece, as really the pivotal country in the pivot in some ways. If I may say, of course I'm ambassador, I'll say that. But it's but it is a very essential place. Now we were only able to do that, to truly engage again with that country, because it started to evolve, that things were starting to move in a direction that were consistent with our interests and our values. It wasn't for just simply lack of interest that we were alienated from each other. It was based on our concern about the human rights and the military dictatorship there. And as we saw things evolve away from that, or at least easing up of the strong iron grip of the military and movement towards an evolutionary movement to something different, then we, as famously, had an action for action policy that sought to meet their actions of change and outreach with our own actions. And I think we've been able to encourage each other. But we are quite realistic about this, of course. Given who we are, we can't have a full embrace of that country, given interest, and not just in the American administration, but in Capitol Hill and in civil society of the United States. We still have very much an interest in seeing our values reflected in the developments inside the country. But in the process, we recognize this is not a revolutionary change inside Myanmar, it's an evolutionary one, that old mindsets exist, that there are tremendous challenges we need to be realistic about, we need to be patient, but we need to be quite clear-eyed. And I think, though, that engagement is still going to be the strategy and the approach. And I think it's incumbent upon us, if we are going to prove to the region that we are here for the long term, that we must continue to work in partnership with Myanmar and the rest of the region on reform and on progress and development.
Thank you. That's great. Now we're going to turn to Kirk and maybe have a look at the canvas from a broader perspective and bring in more all of ASEAN. And also, Kirk, if you don't mind, say a word about TPP. Because I personally believe that the game changer in the U.S. relationship in vis-a-vis Asia, especially this year will be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. And if the TPP happens, it's a really big deal. It really changes everything. So, but there's of course, a lot of skepticism about whether or not TPP will happen. So maybe, Kirk, you can say a few words about that, since you were one of the people who actually believe it's going to happen.
I do deeply. I do deeply. I will tell you, I'm less lonely than I used to be, though. But before I get to that, I wanted to first, Kishore, not only thank you for this, but thank you for your friendship. It's always fun to bring my colleagues in from Washington and around the region and realize that I get to go out for lunch with you on a regular basis, and this is a special occasion for them. So I value our friendship and our interaction very deeply. You mentioned something when you were introducing the panel that, to paraphrase, that the extent of the development and the key to the development in this region is going to be the extent of U.S. engagement in the future. And I think that was a nice way to phrase it, because I think that one of the frustrating parts for me when I got here is the underappreciation for the extent of our engagement for the last 70 years in keeping the safety and security to allow the prosperity of all of Asia to grow. And I also think that we have not done a very good job of communicating what we already are doing in this region. The United States is the single largest investor in ASEAN by a large factor, more than the next 3 countries combined. We are here. There are 3,600 United States businesses based in Singapore. They all have regional, some have global responsibility. And we do things a little differently than some of the other countries in the region. We don't have a lot of state-sponsored investment. We do it through Citi, which is the 3rd largest private employer in Singapore. We do it through Exxon, which is the single largest investment in the history of Singapore. And we do it throughout the region. Even Exxon, where Derek is, we have a lot of restrictions about what we can and can't do. But Unocal, Exxon has been in there through Unocal for 20 years, bringing American values of hiring locally, technology transfer, corporate community, corporate social responsibility programs. So we've already been here and are doing a lot, and I don't know that we've done a good job of talking about it. So the level of engagement in the United States that we have here is not because we've decided it's a good idea. We're here because we have to be. Our economy is based on globalization. We have a global economy, and I would say uniquely positioned to be the indispensable economy worldwide, just because of how we were formed and the talent we attract and the openness of our borders. And so for us, as we go forward, you have 525 million people in Asia today in the middle class. By 2030, that's going to be 2.7 billion. Where are we going to be? We have to be here. This isn't a choice. This is in our national interest to be firmly, deeply, and extrinsically, I can't even say that word today, it's been one of those days, but deeply involved here. So when we go to things like not only TPP, but also the residual benefits that TPP has, we're here because we have to be, it's in our interest, but hopefully we are going to lift up the standards here, which is going to be in the country's interests to exploit the best talent and develop in the best possible way for all of their people. So do I believe TPP is going to get there? Absolutely. As we're sitting here today, we have the negotiators in Honolulu going through sharpening their pencils to get to the final landing point. The reality is, as with any agreement, it's going to be a political decision to get that last bit done, but I think we've identified them. And I think that we will see some very strong movement. We had a very impressive, Joe and I were talking because the CODEL, we had a congressional delegation with Chairman Ryan from the Ways and Means Committee, led 7 people out here. He was here and then went to Malaysia. And in the almost 2 years I've been here, it was by far the best visitor I've had from Washington. And my apologies to Bob, because it was really talking about the process. And we do feel pretty comfortable that Trade Promotion Authority will be granted in the very near future. I think Chairman Ryan has said that publicly. And then the clock ticks. And if there is no backsliding, and if this deal is what people knew they were getting into gets agreed to, I think you will see TPP. But there's also a residual effect to the non-TPP countries that I don't think we talk enough about. If you have the high-end manufacturers, the pharmaceuticals and high-tech manufacturers going to Malaysia and Vietnam, Brunei, and already they're here in Singapore, because of TPP, does that not force other countries, Indonesia, Thailand, and others, to raise their game to be competitive or lose investment? We don't talk about intellectual property in the vacuum just because someone wrote a really smart paper about it. We did it because it spurs investment and it's high-paying jobs. And so we hope that this first tranche of TPP is not the end. I think you've heard everyone involved saying TPP is not a party you get invited to. You agree to the standards and the commitments that any mature free market system economy has. We'd love to have you.
Great. I mean, I like that optimism. So I'm sure we'll have a discussion.
Oh, I
later.
have one more thing. Joe, it wasn't just the students that weren't alive when Lyndon Johnson was president. Neither was I. Sorry.
Now we know how young Kirk is.
Yeah, I don't believe him, actually. I'm going to see his birth certificate.
Hard miles, Derek. Hard miles.
So, Bob, since you're the U.S. senior official to APAC, you've got to again take a broader view of the region, and you've observed what APAC has been doing and so on and so forth.
Right.
And I wonder whether this is a good point, maybe, since China is a member of APAC, to bring in the China dimension in all this. How is China a factor in expanding U.S. engagement in Asia?
Sure. I gather from having just been here a couple of days, we met with Tommy Koh on Tuesday. He made 3 points. When you talked, you said you made 3 points. I guess I better just make 3 points.
It's infectious.
Yeah, so I'll make 3 points. I think it's also sort of difficult sort of being the last because I'm trying to avoid saying what people have said before me, especially Kurt, on the economic front. But the 3 points are this, I think, and I'll mention China as part of it as well towards the end. But I think a lot of people question whether the U.S. is really committed to the region or can endure the region in terms of our interests. And the title here is Expanding U.S. Engagement in Asia. The fact is U.S. has been here for 40 years and been engaged for 40 years in a very big way. As Kurt mentioned, if you include everything, including investment and so on in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, you're reaching almost $1 trillion worth of investment. And so where money goes, essentially, our private sector is involved. So in fact, I'm here this week for the Chamber of Commerce meeting from Asia Pacific, and we have 27 Chamber of Commerce, you were saying, meeting in Singapore this week, and representing hundreds of people, but even beyond that, thousands and thousands in the different economies that they come from or countries that they come from. So we're already invested for 40 years. It's not that we're now expanding today or these few years. So I think that it's no question in my mind that because of the investment we have in this area, both economic and otherwise, we are vested in the region. We're a stakeholder. There's no question, like Kurt was saying, that we will withdraw from it. So I think from that point of view, I think we're deeply invested in here. And as Kishore said, in terms of ASEAN itself, we know that in Asia, if you look historically at Asia, the growth initially was in terms of Japan, Korea, and then, of course, Taiwan, Singapore, and others. Now we all know that the prospects for growth in Southeast Asia is the brightest. Philippines, Vietnam, and so on, now Burma, the growth is there. So clearly, we're going to be involved in this entire process of growth, I think, with Southeast Asia in particular. So again, I think as far as commitment to the United States or enduring presence, I don't have any questions in my mind about that. On the second point of TPP, I just want to make a point on that. I'm not going to talk about the prospects. Kurt has done that already. What I'm going to talk about is just very briefly what the significance of TPP is. It's not just expanding trade and investment in terms of tariffs, tariff barriers, and other kinds of things like that, trade liberalization. What it is in the 29 chapters that we're working on is that we're trying to establish in TPP or through TPP a rules-based trading system that will have a strategic value to the region and hopefully beyond the region in the future. So it's not just about lowering a tariff and then getting something through. Of course, that's an important part of it, especially with our discussions with Japan over autos or agriculture. But really, it's about setting rules that are high standards in terms of labor, environment, and so on. IPR is down the line. So what we do in TPP is extremely significant from that perspective, in particular, from my point of view. So I think we should not lose sight of that. It's a strategic undertaking, not simply, I mean, we have about 800 FTAs around the world and even more, and a lot of them are simply questions of opening access to this or that product. But TPP is not that. It's something that is clearly strategically more significant. The last point on APEC, I've done this for about a year and a half, and what I find about APEC now is that it's moved away from the initial sort of goals of just simply trade and investment liberalization. It's now really moved towards sustaining growth and facilitating and sustaining growth, meaning that we're discussing environmental issues, climate change issues, oceans. Last year in China, the very big thing was on anti-corruption, because anti-corruption is, unfortunately, corruption is a major problem among a lot of APEC economies. And in the future, as we develop, clearly it becomes more and more of a problem. So we're trying to tackle the issue of corruption in the region, in different countries. We're talking about women economic empowerment, inclusive growth in the Philippines this year, working on trying to bring in the SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, more into the economic work stream because they create the jobs and valuable jobs. And we're also moving more now this year in the Philippines into services. Again, in the past we focused on products, tariffs. Now we're looking at services expansion in terms of trying to create a broader framework for cooperation on services trade within the region. So in terms of China, my view is very simple. I've worked in China for 10 years in my foreign service career with others here, friends of ours. But as I see it, it's not a zero-sum game. Some people do look at it that way, saying, okay, if China grows faster to this year than the US, then it's the US losing out, et cetera. I don't see it that way. I think China's growth in the region, to the extent that its investment trade is good for different reasons. One, it helps the Southeast Asian countries in terms of their development, whether it's in investment of infrastructure or whether it's in simply trade, markets. I think it's very good. But beyond that, I really think even more important in some ways is that what it does is it creates an interdependence between China and the region. And that interdependence in economic and trade terms actually then creates the necessity for both sides, for every side, to ensure that we have a stable environment, to allow the trade and the investment to continue. So I don't see it as competition in terms of if they invest more, we invest less, that it means black or white. So I think it's good. I think we all should try to meet the standards in terms of the trade investments. But the point is that it is something that is clearly getting China to become a stakeholder as well. And therefore, as a stakeholder, as Bob Zoellick used to say, a responsible stakeholder, every stakeholder needs to be responsible to be able to maintain that sort of environment for growth.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to, if you don't mind, push the discussion a bit on China, because I think there's a perception out there, I mean, you may agree or disagree with it, that a large part of the US expanded re-engagement in Asia to some extent is being driven by competition with China. Now, I understand, I agree with you that US and China have a close interdependent relationship, and it's a fascinating balance of competition and collaboration within US and China. You collaborate in many areas. Your trade is amazing, it's so large. You educate 300,000 Chinese students in North American universities, but as you were saying, they pay $50,000 each of them, so that's a massive gift from China to America. That works out, I think, roughly about $1 trillion of fees. That's a lot of money. But at the same time, you also have things like when China announces an air defense identification zone, ADIZ, you say, no, that's wrong, and then when China sets up an Asian Investor Infrastructure Bank, you lobby against it, and so South Korea and Australia, Japan don't join it. So it's a complex relationship. Mm-hmm. So on balance, this is pushing you all a bit, how big is the China factor in all this? How would you answer that question? Direct, you want to start? Since you wrote the report on the East Asia strategy.
Yeah, and written a bit on China in the past as well. I can speak simply from my current perch in Myanmar. Not at all. Not at all. not a factor. I know everyone thinks it is. Everyone says, oh, you're in Myanmar all because you want to push out China, and it's a China factor, and it's part of a containment and encirclement strategy. I can say with absolute certainty, and I think Joe can back me up because he was part of the discussions in the early days before he moved out to Malaysia, that China was not a driver of our engagement strategy towards Myanmar. That I have never, I mean, in my conversations with the government, I never raised that issue. We never think about it. We're really focused on our engagement, what we do, what we're about, what we bring to the table, how what we can bring in terms of the values and in business investment and the corporate social responsibility and the transparency and the way we do business generally as a country. We try to bring those to the fore and allow the people of the country to decide how they want to manage their lives. And we think that we can, there's a great deal of pro-American attitude, I think, inside Myanmar. They want to know how we do things because we have been so alienated for so long. But, China simply never comes up in any policy discussion that I have been part of with regard to our policy towards Myanmar. And even though my background, when I was at CSIS, I did a lot of China. I co-wrote books on China. I went to China. I had a lot of friends and talking about the U.S.-China relationship, and I enjoy talking about the U.S.-China relationship. In some ways, I'm disappointed. I've left that at the door entirely and focused completely on the development of Myanmar's, or the evolution of Myanmar's reform process. And if they succeed in what they want, then we will have succeeded and we will benefit in our bilateral relationship. There is no way, if we even wanted Myanmar to stand with the US over China, that they would ever do so. They're a proud country, and if I were advising them, I would say you shouldn't, just like Southeast Asian countries broadly. It shouldn't be a matter of choice. You need to get along with China. You need to have a good relationship with China. I think they have a very complicated history themselves with China, because of both today and in the past. And they're going to have to figure that out. But our relationship will not be based on whether they have a good or bad relationship with China. It'll be simply based on our values and our desire to see what they seem to want, what Aung San Suu Kyi and the opposition and others have seemed to be promoting all these years. And now it seems that Thein Sein and the leadership are also promoting a democratic future, a more open future, with challenges, as we've seen the past few days, but at least promoting that vision that is very consistent with what America's policy has been in that country for 25 years, and entirely consistent with where we like to see it go in the future, and we want to help shape that change. And in the end, we don't see that as coming at the expense of China, but actually, if there is peace and stability in that country, it will be at the benefit of China, ultimately. It will be better because they have a very vulnerable border there.
Joe, you want to add something on that?
Yes, I very much agree. I get the feeling that people in the region, in the capitals in Southeast Asia, as well as Northeast Asia, see more competition between US and China than what I see and what I witness. And I think that may have to do with the region especially wanting to see, China and US compete for hearts and minds or whatever relationship with the country in question. So I think, when you are in Washington or when you're actually practicing, we see much more cooperative element and less competitive element, while I think if you're Singaporean, Malaysian, Japanese, or Korean even, you want to see maybe a little bit more competitive element. So there is that desire. Now, what is, from my perspective in Malaysia, a big part of our issues is dealing, as Bob said, what is rules-based, what is international norm? And I do think, for example, we have been involved in a lot of discussion on South China Sea and various claims and overlapping claims. And in that case, of course, we do want to offer a solution, which is that it should be more rules-based. And that gets to Bob's point, same in trade, same in maritime affairs. So I think that's where you see a difference in views. And again, I think we're doing disservice if we exaggerate that too much.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to throw the floor open for questions, but a quick one or two questions to the panelists. Kirk, we discussed the TPP earlier, and the talk in the market, I'm not privy to the negotiations, is that the biggest country that is standing in the way of a deal clearly is Japan, because Japan has got the most complicated, largest relationship with the United States. Do you think that the issues with Japan can be resolved in the next 2-3 months?
Well,
And if you can say a bit of what the issues are, that would be helpful too.
Well, I think that they are an ever-moving target. So I think that a lot of times you read in the press what are the issues that sometimes aren't. So, and I'm not even sure.
Agriculture, for example.
Pardon me?
Agriculture.
Well, but that's broad. And I would say that my friend, the High Commissioner from Canada, is here. I think that Canada has some issues. I think Australia has some issues. We have
But
some.
Canada is a protectionist country. Haven't you known that?
But darn nice, and a very important friend to America. But I think the point is that the perception that one or two countries have more hurdles than others, I don't actually share, because you look at, for example, the strength of the government in Japan now. Even if that hurdle seems higher, they may have more ability to break through that than maybe some other countries where the hurdle looks lower. And I think the reality is we're at that political point to make a decision. So, I think that I wouldn't read the press. I would, stay tuned in this column to see what's happening. I think we'll know more, at least our governments will know more by the end of this week. But I think there's some benchmarks coming up that are going to move the process forward. But I did want to add one thing to Joe's point. This rules-based system is one that the world has put in place, and I think sometimes out here it gets characterized as an American rules-based system, which I think is just factually inaccurate. And I also think this global rules-based system that has been in place has allowed most of the countries of Asia generally to develop to where they are right now. So whereas some might argue that China wasn't at the table to set these rules, there has been no country that's developed more in the last 20 years than China. So to suggest that those rules need to be changed seems a little quixotic to me. And I do think that we are doing many things with China, like the bilateral investment treaty, which is essentially the investment part of TPP, where we're hopeful to get that done with China. And there's a lot of interest, obviously, from Korea and some in Latin America to join TPP. So these are not American rules that we're trying to enforce. This is a global system that has organically raised up, whether it be from the 4 Ps, of which Singapore was one of the founding members, which we were not, to where we are today with Japan entering the conversation. So I think that this has occurred on a trajectory that we are proud to be part of. We're proud that countries like the US and Singapore agree that high standards make for better investment and better path to prosperity for all citizens. But this is not one country imposing.
Yeah. Last quick question, Bob. I remember that when TPP was first announced, floated and everything, the Chinese reacted very, very negatively and were very concerned about it. Then over time, I noticed a very subtle switch in the Chinese position where actually some Chinese officials that I spoke to, some very senior Chinese officials, actually were discussing the possibility of China joining TPP. Now, do you think that's conceivable? Can China ever meet the standards of a TPP?
The long short of it is, I think, yes.
It can.
And it can. But again, the long and short of it is it may take some time. There's some issues, for example, state-owned enterprises. That's a key issue. And of course, it's a key issue for other countries as well. But China has a state-owned enterprise system that, of course, is gradually being replaced by the private sector and all that. But so there are a number of issues, I think, of the different rules that China will have a problem with joining because it's not really in its interest right now to do so, in terms of simply its economic growth and so on, the way it does things. But I do think it can, because I think in the long term, China is going to move towards more of a market system. The state-owned enterprises are not all that profitable. In fact, they're losing a lot of money. So eventually China, I think, will move in the direction of a system that is more free market-based, that is more rules-based, And so, in the long term, I think, yes, I don't think anything would stop it from doing so, except itself, of course. But it has to move in the reform direction that I think it wants as well for its own good.